It began like any other quiet night in the small town of Oswego, Illinois. The streets were still, families were winding down, and nothing seemed out of place until the call came in. Emergency responders rushed to a home where a young woman was found unresponsive in a car, bleeding from a devastating head wound. Her name was Anisaw Ellen Williams, just 22 years old, full of dreams and life. The story, as told by the only other person present, was that Anisaw had tragically taken her own life. But behind that initial explanation, something didn't sit right. Investigators at the scene couldn't ignore the inconsistencies. The physical evidence didn't quite match the narrative, and the emotional tone didn't feel genuine. Anisaw had reportedly shot herself during a drive with her girlfriend, Alexia tells, who had allegedly tried to comfort her in her final moments. Yet questions began piling up. Why were there signs of a struggle? Why did the sequence of events seem too clean, too rehearsed? As news broke of the young woman's death, the community mourned. Friends and family posted heartfelt tributes online, grieving the sudden loss of someone they loved deeply. But even in those early hours, the people who knew Anisaw best had their doubts. She was strong, passionate, and determined, not someone they believed would end her own life. Whispers of suspicion began to ripple through the community. As authorities dug deeper, what they uncovered would paint a much darker picture, one of emotional turmoil, manipulation, and ultimately cold-blooded violence. Alexia tells, the woman who claimed to have witnessed Anisaw's suicide would soon be at the center of a criminal investigation. The heartbreak of a life lost would soon be joined by the shock of betrayal, as those closest to Anisaw learned what really happened. This wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a calculated attempt to stage a murder as something else entirely. And it would take a careful combination of forensic science, digital evidence, and determination to reveal the truth. In a case that shook Oswego and far beyond, justice would eventually come, but only after layers of lies were peeled back to expose what really happened that night. Today, we look back on the life and loss of Anisaw Ellen Williams, a young woman taken far too soon. We honor her memory by telling the truth of what occurred, by shedding light on the warning signs of intimate partner violence, and by remembering that behind every headline is a heartbeat that once was. This is a story about love turned lethal, and the pursuit of justice that followed. Stay with us as we unfold the events that led up to that fateful evening, the investigation that turned everything around, and the trial that brought closure, if not peace, to Anisaw's grieving loved ones. Before the headlines, before the tragedy, there was a relationship that many believed was built on love. Anisaw Ellen Williams and Alexia tells were two young women navigating the early stages of adulthood, drawn together by what seemed like connection, affection, and shared experience. Anisaw, just 22 years old, had a bright presence, compassionate, driven, and deeply loyal to the people she loved. She believed in second chances and giving people the benefit of the doubt. Alexia tells, on the other hand, was more guarded. At 21, she carried herself with quiet confidence but also seemed to struggle with control. Their relationship, while passionate, was not without tension. Close friends later shared that there were moments of concern, arguments that escalated, sudden changes in Anisaw's mood, and subtle signs that all was not well behind closed doors. Still, Anisaw tried. She cared deeply, and in many ways, that care became her vulnerability. She often took on the emotional weight of the relationship, believing she could help Alexia through her struggles. To outsiders, they may have looked like any other couple navigating ups and downs, but those closer to Anisaw began to notice troubling patterns. Moments of emotional isolation, manipulation, and an uneven dynamic between the two quietly brewed beneath the surface. Despite it all, Anisaw remained hopeful. She had plans for her future, goals she wanted to chase, relationships she wanted to mend, and a sense of self she was growing into. Her connection with Alexia, though complicated, was something she still tried to nurture. Love, after all, is rarely black and white. It's often messy, layered with intentions that don't always match outcomes. But slowly, the relationship became a source of distress. There were times Anisaw pulled away, trying to find her footing again. Yet Alexia would always pull her back in, using a mix of charm, guilt, and emotional dependence to maintain control. Anisaw's inner circle saw her struggling to balance her heart with her peace. It became clear to some that this wasn't just a rocky relationship, it was an unhealthy one. In the months leading up to her death, there were signs Anissa was beginning to rediscover her independence. She talked about moving on, focusing on herself, and reclaiming her space. But those steps, however small, may have sparked fear in Alexia, the fear of losing control, of rejection, of no longer being the center of Anissa's world. And for someone like Alexia, that fear may have been enough to spark something far more dangerous. The tragedy that unfolded wasn't born in a moment. It was rooted in a relationship built on imbalance, blurred boundaries, and emotional instability. Understanding this backdrop is crucial, not just for piecing together what happened that night, but for honoring Anissa's courage, her kindness, and the quiet strength she showed even when the world wasn't watching. It was February 25th, 2022, a date that started like any other for many, but would end in heartbreak for those who loved Anissa Ellen Williams. That night, Anissa and her girlfriend, Alexia tells, were driving together through Oswego, Illinois. The exact details of their conversation remain unknown, but what transpired in that vehicle was not just an emotional outburst or a heated argument. It was the moment everything changed. What had once been a relationship filled with shared memories and promises turned violently tragic. Alexia later told investigators that Anissa had taken her own life, claiming she shot herself in the head while seated in the passenger seat. But from the very beginning, something felt off about that story. First responders noted the calmness in Alexia's voice. Her lack of visible distress struck many as strange. And as detectives examined the scene, inconsistencies began to surface. It wasn't just what was said, it was what was missing: grief, urgency, and truth. When police arrived, they found Anissa gravely wounded. She was slumped over in the car, bleeding and unresponsive. Despite immediate efforts to save her, she later died from her injuries. Alexia stayed close, weaving her account to anyone who would listen, insisting it was a suicide. But the physical evidence refused to cooperate with that narrative. The trajectory of the bullet, the positioning of Anissa's body, the lack of gunpowder residue on her hands. The signs whispered a different story, one filled with silence and deception. As authorities began piecing together the timeline, they found that Alexia's actions immediately after the incident were just as troubling. There was number 911 call made from the scene. Instead, it appeared that precious time had been lost, time that could have made a difference. And while Alexia insisted she tried to console her girlfriend in her final moments, the evidence suggested she had done little to seek help. It felt calculated, not panicked, controlled, not chaotic. Even more chilling was what came next. Investigators uncovered digital trails and surveillance footage that began to poke holes in Alexia's version of events. They found that she had attempted to wipe away clues and create the illusion of a suicide. The scene had been staged, but not well enough to hold up under scrutiny. The truth, as it emerged, was that Anissa had not taken her own life. She had been murdered. That revelation shattered the community. Friends who had once believed Alexia's story now faced the horror that she had taken the life of someone she claimed to love. It was more than betrayal. It was a brutal end to a young life full of promise. And as detectives gathered statements, analyzed the weapon, and reviewed digital communications between the two women, a painful but undeniable picture emerged. Alexia tells had deliberately ended Anissa's life and tried to make it look like anything but murder. The incident marked the beginning of a long and painful journey for Anissa's family, who now had to grapple not just with her loss, but with the knowledge of how she died. For the community, it was a devastating reminder that emotional abuse and control can hide in plain sight, and that violence doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes, it's waiting in the passenger seat, masked as love. In the days following Anissa Ellen Williams' tragic death, investigators weren't satisfied with the simple explanation of suicide. Something in their instinct said, look deeper. The initial story offered by Alexia tells that Anissa had taken her own life simply didn't sit right. The responding officers had noticed it immediately: the calmness in Alexia's voice, her lack of emotional response, and the unsettling precision in her retelling. It wasn't grief, it was distance. Forensic teams began their careful, methodical work. They documented the scene in that vehicle with extraordinary attention to detail. The trajectory of the bullet, the location of the gun, and the absence of gunshot residue on Anissa's hands quickly raised red flags. The angle at which the bullet entered her head wasn't consistent with a self-inflicted wound. Moreover, the position of the firearm, resting unnaturally in the car, seemed staged, almost placed with intent. It was becoming clear this wasn't a suicide scene. It was a cover-up. While the physical evidence unraveled the lie, digital footprints provided further clarity. Investigators obtained text messages between the two women, messages that painted a clearer picture of a relationship fraught with manipulation, emotional dependency, and control. In the days leading up to the shooting, there were arguments. There was tension. And perhaps most telling, there were signs Anissa was preparing to walk away from the relationship. To someone like Alexia, who needed control, that may have felt like abandonment. Further, surveillance footage and witness statements helped authorities piece together the hours leading up to the shooting. Inconsistencies began stacking up. Why hadn't Alexia called for help immediately? Why did her story change in subtle ways every time she was asked to repeat it? These questions led investigators to do more than just examine the evidence. They began scrutinizing Alexia herself, her demeanor, her timeline, her story. And piece by piece, it began to fall apart. One pivotal moment in the investigation came when ballistic analysis confirmed that the shooting couldn't have occurred the way Alexia described. There was no defensive wound, no sign that Anissa had even touched the weapon. The evidence pointed in one direction. This was an execution, not an accident. It was deliberate, cold, and then carefully disguised. Once a forensic puzzle was assembled, the Oswego police and the state's attorney had what they needed. In June 2022, Alexia Tells was officially charged with first-degree murder. That moment, though somber, marked a critical shift in the case, from mystery to justice. It didn't bring Anissa back, but it meant her story would be told truthfully. Her name wouldn't be attached to a false narrative. Through their persistence, compassion, and refusal to accept surface-level answers, investigators honored Anissa's memory. They uncovered not just the truth of what happened that night, but the deeper truths about toxic control, hidden abuse, and the courage it takes to walk away. The investigation was never just about a crime. It was about a young woman's life, stolen too soon, and the system determined to speak for her when she could no longer speak for herself. Once the pieces of the investigation began falling into place, law enforcement officials in Oswego, Illinois, moved swiftly. In June 2022, Alexia Tells was officially charged with first-degree murder in the death of her girlfriend, Anissa Ellen Williams. The initial claims of suicide were no longer credible. What remained was a hard truth, a deliberate act of violence masked by deception. The charge signaled that authorities were not only pursuing justice but taking seriously the intimate dynamics that led to this tragedy. The legal process began with Alexia's arrest and formal booking. In court, she stood expressionless as the charges were read. The gravity of the moment was not lost on anyone present. Prosecutors emphasized the calculated nature of the crime, the effort to stage the scene, the manipulation of the story, and the betrayal of someone who trusted her deeply. This wasn't just a moment of violence. It was a betrayal with premeditated intent. As the case proceeded through pre-trial motions, prosecutors meticulously presented the evidence. They detailed the forensic inconsistencies, the absence of gunshot residue on Anissa's hands, and the angle of the bullet wound, none of which aligned with Alexia's story. Meanwhile, the defense struggled to counter these facts, focusing instead on her mental state and attempting to reframe the incident. But the facts, and the heartbreak behind them, remained unshakable. Throughout the courtroom proceedings, Anissa's family was a quiet yet unwavering presence. Their grief was dignified, their strength steady. Each hearing brought a mix of emotions, anger, sorrow, longing, but also hope that the truth would win. They listened as the evidence unfolded, as expert witnesses explained the science, and as prosecutors painted the full picture of what happened that night. It was painful, but necessary. Eventually, in May 2024, Alexia Tells pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. The guilty plea, while bringing a form of closure, also brought mixed emotions. There was no trial to publicly explore every detail, no cross-examinations or jury verdict. But for the family, what mattered most was the acknowledgement. At last, Alexia admitted responsibility for what she had done. It was no longer a question of if, but how. The judge sentenced Alexia to 33 years in prison, a term that reflected the severity of her actions and the deep impact they had left on Anissa's loved ones. The courtroom was still as the sentence was announced. No cheers, no visible relief, just tears, hugs, and the quiet reality that justice, while imperfect, had been served. It was a moment of solemn accountability, not celebration. In the end, the legal proceedings ensured that Aniso's name would be cleared of any false narratives. She would no longer be defined by how her life ended, but by the love and light she carried in it. The courtroom, so often a place of cold facts and procedure, became a space where truth, dignity, and the memory of a young woman taken too soon were finally honored. As the courtroom fell quiet during sentencing, the weight of grief in the room was nearly tangible. For the family of Aniso Ellen Williams, this moment was not just about justice. It was about finally having their pain acknowledged. For months, they had been trapped in a whirlwind of shock, sorrow, and unanswered questions. The day Alexia Tells was sentenced to 33 years in prison brought no joy, but it did offer something long overdue: truth and accountability. Aniso's mother, her voice trembling yet resolute, addressed the court with raw honesty. She spoke of her daughter's vibrant spirit, her gentle strength, and her dreams that had been cruelly stolen. Aniso wasn't just someone who died in a car, she said. She was someone who lived, who laughed, who gave, who loved. Her words painted a picture not of a crime, but of a full, rich life that ended far too soon. The impact of Aniso's death rippled far beyond her immediate family. Friends, classmates, and even former teachers submitted statements describing the gaping void her absence had created. She had been a light in every room she entered, someone with an infectious laugh, a listening ear, and a future she had just begun to shape. Her loss wasn't just a private sorrow. It became a wound the community carried together. What made it more painful was a betrayal. Alexia wasn't a stranger. She had been welcomed, trusted, and embraced as part of Aniso's world. That the person who took her life was someone she had once loved only deepened the grief. In court, the betrayal echoed in every testimony. Loved ones described the psychological toll of not only losing Aniso, but also processing the way she had been taken from a place of supposed safety and intimacy. Still, amidst the heartbreak, there was a sense of closure. The sentence handed down to Alexia was more than a legal judgment. It was a public acknowledgement of Aniso's truth. For the first time since that tragic night, her family felt heard. They no longer had to carry the burden of a false story. They could finally speak her name without it being shadowed by lies. Aniso's loved ones vowed to honor her memory by speaking out about emotional abuse and intimate partner violence, especially in LGBTQ+ relationships, where such stories are too often overlooked. They launched conversations in their community about recognizing red flags and the importance of emotional safety. In their pain, they chose purpose. In their loss, they chose light. The road to healing will be long. No sentence can replace a daughter, a friend, or a future filled with possibility. But for Aniso's family, justice offered a foundation on which to rebuild, a quiet, steady reminder that her life mattered, her story was real, and she will never be forgotten. When we look back at the heartbreaking story of Aniso Ellen Williams, it becomes more than just a tragic headline. It becomes a deeply human reminder of how dangerous emotional abuse and unaddressed patterns of control can become, even within relationships that appear loving from the outside. Aniso's death was not just a result of one moment. It was a result of a relationship where the warning signs were silent, subtle, and sadly overlooked. This case forces us to broaden our understanding of intimate partner violence, especially within LGBTQ+ relationships. Abuse doesn't always show up with bruises or shouting. Sometimes it appears as emotional manipulation, isolation, and silent control. The fact that Aniso's killer was a girlfriend highlights how abuse can exist in any kind of relationship, and why it's so crucial to speak up, listen closely, and take red flags seriously, no matter the couple involved. For friends and family, this case is a stark wake-up call. We need to be more aware, more present, and more willing to ask difficult questions when something feels off. Love shouldn't hurt, and it certainly shouldn't end in tragedy. Aniso's life reminds us how important it is to create safe spaces where people can share their struggles without fear or shame, especially in relationships where abuse might not be visible to others. There's also something to be said about grief and healing. Aniso's family, despite unimaginable pain, showed courage and grace. They chose to speak her name, to share her story, and to advocate for others so that her death wouldn't be in vain. In their grief, they planted seeds of awareness and strength for other young women, particularly queer women, who may be trapped in unsafe situations or feel unseen. The justice system did what it could, but this story reminds us that true prevention starts much earlier. It starts with education, open dialogue about healthy relationships, and dismantling the stigma around mental health, trauma, and emotional manipulation. We owe it to Anisal and others like her to ensure these conversations reach schools, communities, and homes. Even in loss, Anisal's light remains. Her smile, her kindness, her dreams, all of it lives on through the people who loved her and now carry her legacy. This reflection isn't just about mourning, it's about turning sorrow into purpose. It's about empowering others to recognize their worth and walk away from harm, no matter how complicated or painful that decision may be. So as we reflect on this case, let's hold space for both grief and hope. Let's remember Anisal not for the way her life ended, but for the love and light she gave during her time here. And most importantly, let's honor her by doing the hard but necessary work of making sure others are seen, heard, and safe. As we come to the end of this emotional journey, we want to take a moment to thank you for listening, for caring, and for honoring the life of Anisal Ellen Williams. Stories like this are difficult to tell, but they are incredibly important. If this story moved you, or made you reflect on the people in your own life, we encourage you to stay with us just a little longer. There's more we can do, together. On screen, you'll see links to other stories we've covered, real cases that echo similar themes of love, loss, and the pursuit of justice. These aren't just true crime stories. They're human stories, filled with voices that deserve to be heard. If you felt a connection to Anisal's story, you might also find comfort, insight, or purpose in hearing about others who face unimaginable pain and found strength in the aftermath. One of the videos we've included highlights intimate partner violence awareness in same-sex relationships, a topic that desperately needs more visibility. Many people still don't recognize that abuse can exist in queer relationships, and too often, survivors feel isolated and invalidated. Watching and sharing this content can be a small but meaningful way to break that silence. You'll also find a link to a short piece about healing after trauma, because justice is only one part of the journey. For survivors, families, and communities, healing is long and layered. This video dives into how people find their way through grief and how their loved ones help keep their memory alive. We hope it offers some hope if you or someone you know is going through something difficult. Below that, you'll see a subscribe button. If this video impacted you, please consider subscribing, not just to support our channel, but to become part of a growing community that chooses empathy, awareness, and change over silence. We cover stories that matter, with heart, respect, and the humanity they deserve. And don't forget to turn on notifications. That way, you will never miss when we share new stories, tributes, and updates that aim to not only inform, but also to inspire. Every share, like, and comment helps these stories reach more people who might need to hear them, whether they are survivors, supporters, or simply curious souls seeking truth and understanding. Finally, we ask one last thing. If Anisal's story touched your heart, say her name in the comments. Light a candle in your own way, through words, through action, through compassion. Together, let's keep her memory alive. Thank you for being here, and please take care of yourself and those you love.